The wedding was perfect. The flowers were white. The candles were lit. 300 guests sat in silk-covered chairs inside a venue that cost more than most people make in a decade. And at the center of it all, Camille Ashton, standing at the altar in a dress she didn't choose, marrying a man the world feared. She wasn't supposed to love him. She wasn't even supposed to be here. But she was. And so was Bae Joon-hyuk, standing across from her with the stillest eyes she'd ever seen on a human being, watching her like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. The ceremony had just ended. The guests were rising. Someone started clapping. And then Bae Joon-hyuk turned and walked, not toward Camille, not toward the reception, but toward the side corridor behind the altar. Camille didn't understand. Not yet. She followed the silence. And when she pushed open that door, she saw exactly what her new husband had already seen. The crowd froze. The music stopped. And what Bae Joon-hyuk did next. Nobody in that room will ever forget it. If you've ever watched someone you trusted show you exactly who they really were, stay with me. This one is for you. Drop a fire in the comments right now and let's get into it. The morning of the wedding, Camille stood in front of a hotel mirror and didn't recognize herself. The dress was stunning. Structured ivory silk with a low back and a cathedral train that pooled on the floor like water. Priya had been adjusting her veil for the last 20 minutes, humming something low and nervous. "You don't have to do this," Priya said quietly. "Not for the first time." "Yes, I do." Camille met her own eyes in the mirror. Simone's hospital bills don't pay themselves. That was the deal. Her younger sister, Simone, had been in a medically induced coma for 11 weeks following a car accident. One that Camille still didn't fully believe was accidental. And when Bae Joon-hyuk had shown up at her apartment 3 months ago with a manila folder and an offer, she'd had exactly 2 choices. Sign the contract, or watch the syndicate pull the funding from Simone's private care facility. She signed. She hated herself for it. Then she spent the next 12 weeks slowly, inconveniently, unforgivably falling for the man she was supposed to survive. "He actually looks at you," Priya said, still fussing with the veil. "Like really looks at you. Have you noticed that?" "Priya, I'm just saying. Most men in his position married for territory or titles. He didn't have to pick you." Camille didn't answer that, because she'd been trying not to think about it for weeks. A knock at the door. Soft, precise. 3 taps. Priya opened it. One of Joon-hyuk's men handed her an envelope without a word. Inside, a card handwritten in Korean on one side, translated on the other in Joon-hyuk's tight, controlled script. "Whatever you feel today, I hope you know the arrangement was never the point." Camille read it twice, then folded it into her bouquet. Downstairs in the corridor behind the main hall, Deacon Parrish smoothed his lapels and checked his phone. He had a call to make before the ceremony started. A quiet one. Something that needed to be set in motion before the day was over. He smiled at his reflection in a framed mirror. Everything was going exactly as planned. He didn't know that Joon-hyuk's men had been watching him for 6 days. He didn't know that the smile on his face was the last one he'd wear in public for a very long time. But he would find out soon. Because what happened in that corridor changed everything, and not the way Deacon intended. Bae Joon-hyuk did not get emotional. That was a fact his entire organization understood without being told. He had attended funerals without flinching, handled negotiations with men who pointed guns at his head, and built an empire in a country that tried to erase him at every turn. Emotion was a liability. He'd learned that early. But standing at the altar, watching Camille walk toward him, something moved in his chest that he didn't have vocabulary for. She wasn't performing. That was the thing that got him. Every other person in that room, the guests, the officiants, even some of his own men, was performing, playing their role in the theater of power and appearance. Camille walked like a woman who had decided, quietly and firmly, that she was going to show up to her own life even if that life had been handed to her against her will. No performance. Just presence. He told himself the arrangement was strategic. He needed legitimacy. A public marriage would stabilize certain alliances. It was business. He believed that. Until week 4, when she'd walked into his study at 2 in the morning because she couldn't sleep, sat down across from him without asking and said, "What are you afraid of?" No one had ever asked him that. Not in 34 years. He hadn't answered. But she hadn't left either. They'd sat in silence until sunrise, and something shifted between them that neither of them named. Now she was 3 feet away. The officiant was speaking. Deacon stood at his right shoulder, exactly where a best man should stand, smiling, composed, the picture of loyalty. Junhyuk had known Deacon Parrish for 11 years. They'd grown up in the same network, fought the same enemies, built the same infrastructure. When Junhyuk's father died and half the organization tried to splinter off, Deacon was the one who stood in the gap. He was the brother Junhyuk never had. Or so he'd believed. Woo Sang-il had come to him 4 days ago. A photograph. A recorded call. Names and amounts. A timeline so precise it felt like a confession. Junhyuk had looked at the evidence for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he'd said 3 words. Let it run. He needed to see it himself. He needed to know exactly how deep the betrayal went before he acted. And more than that, he needed to know if Camille was part of it. The officiant said, "You may now." Junhyuk held up one hand. Not to stop the ceremony. To stop the music. The room went quiet instantly. Even the guests who didn't know who he was could feel the shift, that drop in temperature, that sudden inexplicable sense that something enormous was about to happen. He turned from the altar and walked, not toward the exit, toward the side corridor. The one Wu had told him about. The one with the security blind spot Deacon had specifically requested during venue walkthrough. Camille watched him go. Her stomach dropped. She followed. And so did every eye in the room. The door was cracked open. Junhyuk pushed it with 2 fingers. The corridor was narrow, storage on one side, a caterer's station on the other, fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly overhead. And in the middle of it, pressed against the far wall, was Deacon Parrish. Not alone. Camille stopped breathing. The woman was one of the syndicate's social liaisons. Someone Deacon had brought into the organization 18 months ago, vouched for personally, given access to 3 different operational layers. She was also, Wu's file revealed, a corporate intelligence operative working for a rival network. The moment the door opened, Deacon stepped back. He saw Junhyuk first. Something flickered across his face, not guilt. Calculation. He was already running the angles. June. Don't. One word. Flat. Behind Junhyuk, Camille stepped into the doorway. Her hand gripped the door frame. She looked at Deacon, then at the woman, then at the look on Deacon's face, and she understood instantly. Not just what this was. What it meant. You planned this, she said softly. Deacon's eyes cut to her. Something shifted in them. You don't know what you're talking about. You wanted him to walk in here. Camille's voice was steady in a way that clearly surprised him. You wanted the crowd to see. You wanted a scene. You wanted him distracted, humiliated, reactive. She tilted her head. What happens to the Bay Syndicate if he acts out publicly on his wedding day? Who benefits? The silence was long. Then Deacon laughed, low and controlled. You're smarter than I gave you credit for. Most people are. Junhyuk hadn't moved. Hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't touched a single thing. He simply stood there, looking at the man he'd spent a decade trusting, and the stillness coming off him was so complete it felt like the room was holding its breath. Then he turned to Camille. Go back to the altar, he said quietly. Junhyuk. Please. The word was so unexpected, so soft, that it stopped her mid-sentence. He almost never said please. I need you where I can see you. She searched his face. Then she nodded, gathered her train, and walked back toward the altar like a woman who had just chosen a side, even if she hadn't meant to. The crowd was still standing, still silent. Junhyuk reached into his jacket pocket. Not for a weapon. For a phone. He pressed one button. Wu Sang-il stepped in through the venue's rear entrance. Deacon saw him. And for the first time all day, Deacon's calculation failed him. We are not even halfway through, and this story is already breaking records in my head. If you're locked in, smash that like button. It keeps this channel going and tells me to never stop telling stories like this. Now let's keep going. Junhyuk walked back into the main hall. Alone. The crowd, 300 people, many of them powerful, all of them confused, watched him cross the floor in complete silence. His expression was impossible to read. His steps were measured. He reached the altar, turned to face the room and waited. Camille stood beside him. She hadn't been told what to do next. She did what she always did. She read the room and she stayed still. The officiant looked between them nervously. "Should we continue?" "In a moment," Junhyuk said. He reached into his jacket again. This time he produced a single folded document. He opened it calmly, like a man reviewing board meeting minutes. "Several of you in this room," he said clearly, "have been doing business with my organization under arrangements that Deacon Parish brokered." A pause. "Arrangements I was not made aware of. Funds redirected. Information sold. Loyalties split." Another pause. "I know who. I know how much. I know when." No one moved. "I'm not going to humiliate anyone publicly today. That's not what this day is." He folded the document. "But I want every one of you to understand something very clearly. The Bay Syndicate has not changed leadership. It will not be changing leadership. And the next person who tests that assumption will not receive the courtesy of a wedding venue conversation." He tucked the document back into his jacket. Then he turned to Camille and his voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to something quieter than the room expected. "I'm sorry," he said. She blinked. "For what?" "For making today about this." His jaw tightened slightly. "You deserved better than this." Camille looked at him for a long moment. 300 people watched her do it. Then she said very quietly, "Ask me again." He frowned. "Ask you what?" "Ask me to marry you." She held his gaze. "Not the arrangement. Not the contract. Ask me." The room was so silent you could hear the candles burning. Junhyuk looked at her with an expression no one in his organization had ever seen on his face, something open, unguarded, almost young. Then he said, "Camille Ashton, will you?" A crash from the back of the venue. Everyone turned. The rear doors had blown open. And standing between them, flanked by men in dark suits who were very clearly not wedding guests, was someone Camille had never expected to see again. Someone she thought was dead. Her name was Sable Wren. And she was the woman who had recruited Deacon Parish into this plan 2 years before any of it touched the Bay Syndicate. Camille didn't know her by that name. She knew her by a different one. A name from 7 years ago, from a different city, from a chapter of her life she had worked very hard to close. Camille. Sable's voice carried across the room without effort. She had that kind of presence, controlled, deliberate, the kind of person who walked into any space and immediately began recalculating its geometry. "You look beautiful." Camille didn't move. "I thought you were dead." "People keep saying that." She smiled. "Disappointing, isn't it?" Sable Wren was 41 years old, mixed race, and had worked in private intelligence for 2 decades. She had built and dismantled organizations across 4 continents. She was not affiliated with any government, any ideology, or any principle beyond leverage. She operated purely in what she called the architecture of dependency, finding the hidden weight-bearing walls in powerful structures and removing them quietly for whoever paid best. The Bay Syndicate was her largest contract to date. And Camille, though she had no idea, was the key Sable had built the entire plan around. Because Camille had something Sable needed. Something she'd been searching for since they last saw each other, 7 years ago, in a federal building in Washington, D.C., when Camille was still a contract attorney and had witnessed something she was never supposed to see. She'd signed an NDA and moved on with her life. She hadn't realized the NDA was the trap. Aunt Dorinda shifted in her front row seat and leaned toward Priya. "Who is that woman and why does she look like trouble with a blowout?" Priya grabbed Dorinda's hand. "Please don't say anything." "I'm not gonna say anything." "Beat. Yet." Wu Sang-il had already positioned 3 men at the side exits. Junhyuk hadn't turned around. He was still facing Camille. "Do you know her?" he asked quietly. "Unfortunately," Camille said. "Is she dangerous?" "Only to people who think they know what she wants." Junhyuk finally turned. And when Sable Wren saw his face, the absolute, controlled certainty in it, something passed across her expression that might have been, for just 1 second, hesitation. She recovered quickly. "I didn't come for a fight," she announced to the room. "I came to make an offer." Her eyes went back to Camille. One that Camille is going to want to hear. Because it involves her sister. Camille's blood ran cold. Simone is awake, Sable said. And she remembers everything. The venue's private anteroom seated 8. 12 people were currently crammed into it. Camille, Junhyuk, Woosangael, Priya, who had refused to leave, Aunt Dorinda, who nobody had successfully redirected, Sable and 2 of her men, and in the corner, hands bound and expression hollow, Deacon Parrish, who had been brought in from the corridor and deposited in a chair like a piece of evidence. Sable sat across from Camille and spoke without theater. Simone's car accident hadn't been an accident. The driver had been paid. The purpose had been to sideline Camille, to make her desperate enough to accept the first lifeline offered. The lifeline, of course, being Junhyuk's arrangement. You engineered the accident, Camille said. Flat. No question mark. I created conditions, Sable said carefully. That's a no from me, Aunt Dorinda said from the corner. Nobody shushed her this time. Why? Camille's voice was quiet, dangerous in its quietness. Why did you need me inside the Bay Syndicate? Sable leaned forward. 7 years ago, you witnessed a document transfer in the Meridian Tower building. You were waiting for a client meeting. 2 men in the conference room across the hall. She watched Camille's face carefully. One of them was a U.S. deputy trade attaché. The other worked for a shell company that routes capital for 4 different intelligence agencies across 3 governments. You saw them. You signed the NDA within 48 hours. Pause. What you didn't know is that the NDA contained a disclosure clause, one that made everything you witnessed, and everything you could legally testify to, the intellectual property of the third-party firm that issued the document. Camille was very still. That firm, Sable said, is mine. Junhyuk spoke for the first time since they'd entered the room. What does any of this have to do with my organization? Sable looked at him. The attaché you were negotiating Eastern Port access with last quarter? He's the same man. And the paper trail from that deal, if Camille testifies to what she saw 7 years ago, puts your syndicate in the middle of a federal intelligence operation that has been running for a decade. Silence. So you don't want money, Junhyuk said slowly. I want immunity. Your distribution network has reached that, mine doesn't. I want a corridor. Quiet. 6 months. After that, the NDA dissolves, Camille's testimony goes nowhere, and we never speak again. Deacon laughed from his corner. She's bluffing. She always bluffs. Sable didn't look at him. Deacon, you were a tool. You were used. Please stop talking. His jaw tightened. Camille stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her dress. She looked at Sable with an expression that was so composed it was almost unsettling. You wrecked my sister's life, she said. You destroyed her body, her memory, her future, to use me as a pawn in a business negotiation. I made a calculated. Don't. Camille shook her head once. Don't use business language. Say what it was. Sable looked at her. Say it. A long pause. I hurt her, Sable said quietly. And it wasn't remorse, it was acknowledgement. Which, from Sable, might have been the most honest thing she'd ever said. Camille nodded slowly. Then she turned to Junhyuk. She's not bluffing, Camille said. But she's also not telling you everything. The NDA has a counter clause. She paused. One she probably forgot I read. 3 times. Sable's composure shifted. Just slightly. 7 years ago, Camille Ashton had not been a witness. She had been an attorney. A very good one. A meticulous one. One who, upon receiving an NDA that gave her 48 hours to review and sign, had read every line of it, including the counterclause buried in subsection 14C, that the firm issuing the document almost certainly expected no one to find. The clause stated, in the event the issuing party utilizes the subject's testimony as leverage in any commercial, governmental, or private negotiation, the NDA becomes null and void and the subject retains full legal authority to disclose. Camille looked at Sable calmly. You tried to use my testimony as leverage the moment you walked into this room, she said. In front of 11 witnesses. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. The kind that forms when a room full of powerful people realizes the math just changed and no one communicated the memo. Sable's expression was unreadable for 3 full seconds. Then she said, You're bluffing. I'm an attorney, Camille said. I don't bluff. I will prepare. Priya, from the corner, made a noise that was a barely suppressed sound of pride. Aunt Dorinda said, "That's my baby." Junhyuk looked at Camille. Something moved behind his eyes, something Woo Sang-il would later describe, with genuine bewilderment, as looking like a man who had just fallen in love in a law deposition. Sable stood up slowly. "If you disclose, the attaché goes down. The shell company unravels." "Yes." Camille nodded. "And before you say it, I know that impacts the Bay Syndicate's port deal." "I know. So here's what I'm offering instead." She tilted her head. "Walk away. Take Deacon. Go back to wherever you came from. And I will sit on that testimony for the rest of my life. Not because of the NDA. Because I choose to." "In exchange for what?" "In exchange for Simone's medical records, her full care history, and the name of the driver." Sable studied her. "You're going to pursue the driver," Sable said slowly. "Every legal avenue available." Camille's voice didn't waver. "That part is non-negotiable." Another long silence. "You're not what I modeled you as," Sable said finally. "Nobody ever is," Camille said. Sable reached into her jacket and pulled out a small drive. Set it on the table. "Everything you asked for." She looked at Junhyuk. "She's remarkable," she said. Almost like a concession. Almost like a compliment. Junhyuk said nothing. But his eyes were already back on Camille. He would look at her that way, with that particular quality of attention, for the rest of his life. The guests had been moved to the reception hall. Someone, Wu presumably, had arranged for the open bar to come out an hour early. No one was asking questions. Some of them understood. The ones who didn't were enjoying the champagne. Deacon Parrish sat in the anteroom after Sable and her men left. His wrists were still bound. His expression had moved through anger, calculation, negotiation, and had landed finally on something hollow. Junhyuk sat across from him. They were alone. Junhyuk had dismissed everyone, including Wu. The silence lasted a full minute. "You were my brother," Junhyuk said. Not an accusation. Almost a fact. The way you'd say the sky is blue. Deacon's jaw worked. "You know why I did it. Tell me anyway." "Because you were going to be untouchable." Deacon's voice came out rough, compressed. "You married her, you stabilized the alliances, you locked in the port access, you were going to be invincible. And I was going to spend the rest of my career being the man who stood one step behind you." He exhaled. 11 years, June. 11 years and you never." He stopped. "Never what?" A long pause. "Never saw me." Junhyuk was quiet. "I saw you," he said finally. "More than you know." He leaned back. "I recommended you for the CO Consortium lead last year. They declined because of your background. I spent 4 months renegotiating on your behalf off the books so you wouldn't feel the indignity of it. The additional funding you received this quarter? I restructured 3 contracts to generate it. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel like a charity project." Deacon blinked. "I trusted you with my life," Junhyuk said simply. "Not because I had to. Because I chose to. Every day I chose to." The silence that followed was different from all the others. It had weight. Texture. Deacon's eyes dropped to the floor. "I didn't know," he said. And for the first time the calculation was completely gone from his voice. "No," Junhyuk said. "You didn't ask." He stood up. Smoothed his jacket. "Wu will handle the logistics. You'll have 48 hours to liquidate what you can and leave the country. I won't pursue you." He paused. "But I won't protect you either. Whatever Sable does with you, that's between you and the choices you made." He walked toward the door. "June." He stopped. Didn't turn. "I'm sorry," Deacon said. "I mean it." Junhyuk stood with his hand on the doorframe for a moment. "I know," he said quietly. And then he was gone. And what was waiting on the other side of that door? Nobody in the building expected it. Not even him. The reception hall had been rearranged. Not by Wu. Not by the venue staff. By Aunt Dorinda. Nobody was entirely sure how she'd done it so quickly. Priya had helped clearly. The flowers from the main altar had been moved to the center of the room, candles repositioned, the long guest tables pushed back to create an open space. The officiant had been found, calmed down and convinced to stay with a combination of genuine charm and implied social pressure that Aunt Dorinda had perfected over 6 decades. When Junhyuk walked in, the room was full and quiet. 300 people. Every single one of them is still there. Camille stood at the center of the flower arrangements in her wedding dress, which somehow looked even better than it had 2 hours ago. She'd repainted part of her hair. She held the card Junhyuk had sent that morning, the one from the bouquet, in her left hand. She looked at him. He looked at her. Someone in the back of the room started to cry. Based on the sound, it was probably Priya. Junhyuk walked toward her. Each step measured, deliberate. And then he stopped in front of her and did something no one had ever seen him do in his life. He reached out and took both of her hands and stood there without an agenda, without calculation, without armor. Just there. "Camille Ashton," he said quietly. "Will you marry me?" Not the arrangement. Not the contract. He searched her face. "Me." She looked at the man in front of her. This impossible, complicated, dangerous, careful man who had sent her a handwritten note on their wedding morning and said please when he needed her safe and spent 4 months in quiet negotiation on behalf of someone he considered a brother. "Yes," she said. And the room, 300 guests, a bewildered officiant, Woo Sang-il standing at the back wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set in what might, on anyone else, have been called a smile, erupted. Aunt Dorinda stood up and raised both hands to the ceiling like she was in Sunday service. The officiant, bless him, found his rhythm. And in that room, in that light, surrounded by people who had watched the whole impossible day unfold, Bae Junhyuk and Camille Ashton got married for real. 2 months later, Simone Ashton woke fully. Her memory returned in pieces, and what she remembered confirmed everything Camille had suspected. The driver was prosecuted. The case was airtight. Deacon Parrish left the country within his 48-hour window and disappeared into Eastern Europe. Junhyuk neither pursued him nor protected him. He had meant what he said. Sable Ren honored her agreement. The care records were complete, the NDA voided by her own actions. She vanished back into the architecture of dependency that was her world, presumably building the next thing, targeting the next structure. Camille made a note of every name on that drive. She was an attorney. She was patient. The Bay Syndicate stabilized. The port deal restructured cleanly once the compromised parties were removed. Woo Sang-il said 7 words about the whole affair. "It went better than I expected. Good wife." From Woo, that was practically a speech. Junhyuk and Camille didn't become simple. They were never going to be simple. His world was what it was. She had walked into it with open eyes. But what they built inside of it, the space between them, the quiet study at 2 in the morning, the handwritten notes, the way he said please when it mattered, that was theirs. All of it. On the night Simone was discharged from the hospital, Camille stood in the parking lot under open sky and breathed. Junhyuk stood